Remember, 2008 was utterly unexpected. It wasn't planned. It wasn't designed. Trump's shock is a designer shock. He chose it. So in that sense, I think we need to compare it to the events of the 15th of August, 1971, the Richard Nixon shock, which was an attempt, just like Trump is attempting to upend the world economic system. Richard Nixon did exactly the same thing with enormous success, I have to say, not from the perspective of the peoples of the world, not even the American working class or middle class, but from the perspective of those in Washington, D.C. and Camp David, to be more precise, for that summer's day in 1971, whose job was, or whose remit was, to extend American hegemony in an era when America had become a deficit country. So there are many similarities with 1971.
In 1971, that was Richard Nixon taking America away from the gold standard, so moving to a fiat currency system. I mean, you're much more of an expert on that era than I am, and sort of this issue in general. Were people saying a similar thing back then, though? Because I know, people do put forward there could be a theory behind Trump's actions trying to reshape the global economy in a similar way that Nixon did back then. But also, what Trump's doing does just seem like sort of chaotic. I imagine that Nixon was a little bit more rational than Trump is now, or do you have a different perspective?
Not in the slightest. Back then, it didn't look rational. It looked like economic nationalism, geoeconomics, put it as you wish. Remember, 2 days before the Nixon shock, his Treasury Secretary, John Connolly, was the Texan politician who was in the car with JFK when JFK was shot. And he transferred to the Republicans and became Nixon's Treasury Secretary. A couple of days before the Nixon shock, in a bid to encourage him to go ahead with that, he infamously said to the president the following, and I think it's verbatim. He said, "Mr. President, my understanding is that the foreigners are trying to screw us, and our job is to screw them before they screw us." That's verbatim. And 2 days later, with a view to diminish the value of the dollar by 30%, to create magnificent forces of destruction in Europe, in Japan, and also in the United States, forces that he knew would impact very significantly on the American economy. Think of the stagflation that hit the American economy. But the theory was that the impact on the American economy would be lesser than the impact on Germany and Japan in particular, and that would restore the American hegemony, which they were fearing they were losing as a result of becoming a deficit country. There was nothing mild or more rational about what Nixon did in 1971. It doesn't mean that what Trump is doing now is going to succeed, because Nixon's shock could easily have ended up very, very differently. So it will all depend on how the rest of the world reacts to Trump, not so much on the rationality or irrationality of what he's doing at the moment.
Let's talk about what the headlines have all been about this weekend, which is the stock markets and their crash, sort of falling between sort of 5 and 15%. Should Novara media viewers care if the stock market is taking a hit?
Well, in the same way that Novara media audiences have no right to rejoice when the markets go through the roof, we don't have the right to take their collapse or temporary fall as a sign that all hell is coming loose. Look, the manner in which stock exchanges and money markets progress is highly divorced from the way in which humanity progresses. So there may be a coincidence of exuberance or disaster, but it's just a coincidence. Very often, when the stock exchanges are celebrating, the vast majority of the population are suffering, and vice versa. So the big question here is this. What has been happening since 1971, between 1971 and today, is a very significant class war against the working class of the United States, the working class of Britain, the working class of Germany, the working class of China, waged by an interesting coalition between American rentiers, who no longer wished to be capitalists. They were happy simply to collect rents through the financial sector, through private equity, through big tech, and the capitalists of Germany, the capitalists of Japan, and the capitalists of China. The status quo that the radical center is lamenting today, because it is true that the Trump shock is a major blow at this liberal order. The status quo that they've been lamenting has been a highly, grossly imbalanced one where inequality has been rising triumphantly at the expense of the capacity of most people to imagine that the world will be better for their children than it is for them. So this is what the status quo is. It could get worse. There's no doubt about that. Mrs. Thatcher taught me as a young man that when you think that things can't get worse, they do. But the interesting question is now, take China, for instance. Is China going to respond to Trump by raising the living standards of the Chinese so that they can consume more of the stuff that so far has been going to the United States in the form of net exports? Will they find some way of communicating with the inane Europeans who seem to have absolutely no idea of what is going on? Or is Europe and China going to engage in a tariff war between them as the European Union tries to impede the diversion of China's net exports from the United States to Europe? So it will all depend on that. And unfortunately, the majority of people out there, whether we're talking about the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy, Spain, have no say in very significant decisions that will determine whether the shock of Donald Trump can become a force for good or another force that enhances inequality and diminishes their prospects.
I mean, a response to sort of Donald Trump's trade war, I think, from many in the liberal establishment has been to sort of say everything was perfect before. Is there a danger you're going in sort of too far in the other direction? Because, I mean, if you look at what's happened since 1971, yes, inequality has increased, especially in sort of Western countries. But in China, for example, hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And there are countries like Vietnam and Bangladesh, which seem to have been on that trajectory to some degree, incomes rising, the middle class growing, and sort of Trump putting an end to the system whereby countries like China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh can get rich via export-led growth. You know, that might be something we would miss, no?
Look, indeed, capitalism is a terrible system, but it can only get worse sometimes if the powers that be act in the way that ruling classes have acted before, that is, idiotically. So, look, you know me because I sort of became politically active as a result of the Euro crisis. What was the Euro crisis? Were things going swimmingly in Europe for the majority of people up until 2010? No. Things were extremely hard for large sections of the working class across Europe. And the Euro crisis came. It was an opportunity to improve things, but it was also an opportunity to make things worse. And it turned out that it made them worse. So it is highly plausible that Donald Trump's shock is going to reduce prosperity even below the levels at which we found it 2 weeks ago or so. But on the other hand, let us not forget that the rise of living standards that you refer to go hand in hand with a substantial reduction in the quality of life for many of the people whose incomes have increased. Because here's an example of it is perhaps a pointed example, an example that may seem out of place, but it isn't. Think of the natives in Australia. In 1788, when the British arrived there, they had zero income. Now, the Aborigines in Australia, they have an income which is a few $1,000s a year. When were they better off? When they had zero income or today? So you see where I'm getting at. The manner in which globalization steamrolled over the working classes of Vietnam, of China,